Rylix! Hey, Rylix! Rylix glanced up to see Jorvin waving a claw at him across the mess hall. I heard there was an emergency down on the engineering level a few cycles ago, but nobody seems to want to talk about it. Care to fill me in? Rustling softly, Ensign Rylix said. Commands instructed us to keep quiet about it to avoid spreading rumors. We had a fuel pod we thought was depleted suddenly reactivate during disposal. Our new chief engineer, Commander Leonard, attempted to secure it in containment but didn't succeed. It exploded right in his hands. In his hands? He picked up a reigniting fuel pod with his hands? A soft, grinding noise emanated from Jorvin, a sound of surprise. Rylix continued. Leonard ended up absorbing most of the shrapnel that didn't hit a bulkhead, with his body, and probably saved more than a few lives down there. Mine included. I never got a chance to meet Leonard, but that's a terrible way to go. You said he was our new chief engineer? Who's going to replace him? Rylix blinked at the comment. Replace him? Yeah, I mean, there's no way he was able to survive a close proximity fuel pod explosion, right? Oh, Leonard is fine. I guess you didn't know he was a human? They're surprisingly resilient. The infirmary had to sedate him to keep him from showing up for his most recent shift, in fact. Heavily sedate. Kept insisting he could hear the engines were out of alignment, and he needed to keep an eye on Lieutenant Griggles. You're serious? Rylix chuckled a bit at that. Everyone was always a bit incredulous over it at first. Rylix may have told this story once or twice already. Yeah, he was hurt, but once the shrapnel was picked out and the fingers were reattached, he was mostly fine. They had to sew up some of his wounds. He should make a full recovery and be back to cursing out the fusion reactor and Griggles before too long. Has to be the fastest I've seen a chief engineer gain the respect of his entire department, too. Jorvin's mandibles hung at an odd angle, taking in what he was hearing. They reattached his fingers? As in, his fingers were blown off. Technically cut off from shrapnel. And they simply reattached them? Correct. With bits of string threaded through his fleshy bits. They did all his wounds that way, in fact. Picked out the shrapnel, then threaded string through his flesh in order to close the wounds up. And he was okay with this. He was the one who told them how to do it. Dr. Lorak apparently thought humans were indestructible and never bothered to read up on their medical needs. He wasn't quite sure what to do when the carapace regenerator had no effect on his, I think it's called skin. Jorvin couldn't take it anymore. I see what's happening here. Alright, you got me. Your human is indestructible just like the stories. So what really happened? Claw to Clagathor the Annihilator, long may he suffer in eternal damnation, I swear that this is 100% true. I have a dozen eyewitness reports to corroborate it, and a few reports from witnesses with a dozen eyes. This really isn't even all that weird for a human. When I was working on the Chokra's Bane, I watched a human fall from a height of almost 16 units. He stood up and dusted himself off, but we only found out later he had fractured his endoskeleton in 6 different places in his lower extremities. It wasn't until the captain ordered him to report for a medical examination that it was discovered, and until then he had simply continued to walk on it. A Garathian medic slid into a nearby chair, chittering excitedly. Are we sharing human stories? Rylix gave Jorvin a pointed I told you so look as the short twitching furball continued. I grew up on a mining colony before I joined the fleet. I worked with a human named Corey. One day we were working a big vein and someone got a little carried away with the blasting charges, causing a cave-in. We lost a few good men that day, but poor Corey couldn't quite make it out quick enough, and his arm got pinned under a rock. We tried, but we couldn't move it. There was no telling when the rescue crew would show up with the heavy equipment. We just knew there was no way Corey was going to survive having an upper extremity crush like that. Corey, though, had other plans. He sent us to his locker and had us retrieve a bottle of ethanol, an old shirt, and a pipe wrench. At first we assumed he was going to try to kill himself with the ethanol, a little gruesome sure but quicker than being in pain like this. But he then instructed us to make a tourniquet and, Jorvin interrupted. A tourniquet? What is that? Oh, it's hard to explain because I can't imagine any other time that it would be useful. Apparently human medkits carry them as standard equipment. They use them often enough that they even know how to improvise one. You take a piece of cloth and wrap it around an appendage. Then use something long and solid to twist it until it cuts off their arterial flow. Useless for an exoskeletal species, and most endoskeletal species wouldn't even have a use for it. Any injury great enough to need one would likely be fatal. But once the tourniquet was applied, the human pointed to a circular saw and said, "Cut it off." Called it amputation. Based on his reaction, the pain had to be extreme, but once it was done the tourniquet kept his blood inside, and he was able to walk out of the mine. Under his own power. And what's more, the human medic that tended him was so unperturbed that he actually offered to give him a hand. Corey is the whole reason I became a medic, in fact. Wow, sounds like that human had at least 4 huge brass glowguards. A large, hairy Herxan heartily laughed as he sat down next to the obviously uncomfortable Garathian. Have you heard of how the Herxan joined the Alliance? Ha! Until then we had seen the Alliance as nothing but weak and easily killed cowards. The Herxan paused to glance disdainfully at the Garathian before continuing. None of you had shown us the kind of bravery that was worthy of respect. That is until the great human warrior Caitlin Marie showed us that even human children are more brave than the greatest warriors of some of the other races. Again, he briefly looked down on the Garathian before continuing. During an early meeting with the humans to determine if they would even be worthy of being crushed within our mighty grasp, this human child uttered a terrible war cry before viciously attacking the great and eternal warlord Lord, undefeated in 1,000 battles. Though she was small, she was vicious and made to strangle the warlord where he stood, in complete disregard of his retinue of guards. Of course, she was small and far too weak to harm a mighty Herxan warrior, but the warlord was so taken, and amused, by her reckless bravery that he signed the first non-aggression pact in the history of our species. Finally we had found a race of beings we could trust on the battlefield, who showed such bravery and honor. And of course, they proved their courage time and time again over the years. You have them to thank for us eventually joining the Alliance. Although many had their misgivings, none can argue that the Alliance have brought us many great battles that we otherwise would not be able to recount stories of today. In honor of Caitlin Marie, Scourge of 1,000 Sundays and applier of claw paint, many of our warriors will still mimic her battle cry, Mamlo Gapupi. The Garathian shied away from the Herxan's sudden shout, and bumped into another crew member that had huddled in a little too close to the conversation. A small crowd had begun to gather, each sharing their own amazing human story. You know how human ships sometimes have fire coming out of the engine even in the vacuum of space? Did you know they engineered a specific form of condensed oxygen gel as a fuel additive to create that effect? It makes their engines terribly inefficient, and runs a disturbingly high chance of explosion. But they claim it just looks cool. I once saw a human consume no less than 70 units of ethanol. He called it scotch and claimed he made it himself in an unused locker. Despite drinking an obviously toxic quantity, and eventually losing consciousness, this was a common tradition for him, and he seemed to suffer no long-term effects. I worked with a human back in my merchant fleet days. He was uncomfortable around anything with more than 4 legs or an exoskeleton, and would often go into a full-blown panic around smaller pests. He once spent 2 weeks in the brig because he refused to go into a maintenance tunnel with a small dynamite infestation, and we spent more than a little time making fun of him over it. But then the Romag boarded our ship. Ever seen a Romag? 3 units tall, between 30 and 75 leg pairs depending on caste, multi-segmented exoskeleton, and huge compound eyes. With nothing but a small hand tool called a hatchet he ran screaming into a swarm of them, leaving nothing but viscera, carapace, and a trail of urine in his wake. We stopped making fun of him after that. You know, I have a lot of great human stories. As one, the crowd turned to see a smiling Leonard, standing there with a few bruises, some facial stitches, and an arm in a sling. You think this was crazy? Let me tell you about my cousin Kevin.